I'm Layman Pascal, and this is an integral stage discussion with a guy who, rightly or wrongly, I'm going to treat as an expert on integral Christianity. It's Paul Smith. Hey, Paul.
Hi, Layman.
Great to see you. I've got a lot of questions in my mind, or wherever it is questions are stored. I'm really interested in your sort of take, your overall feeling on where integral Christianity is and where it might be going. But I think a neat place to start would be your journey with Christ, let's call it. Like, looking back, what are some of the major phases in your understanding and relationship to Christianity? How has that evolved for you?
Yeah. Well, I was a Southern Baptist before I was born. My pregnant mother enrolled me in the nursery of the local Southern Baptist church, and that's where I grew up. It was moderate. It wasn't terribly fundamentalist. And I stayed with Southern Baptists up until they kicked me out 8 years ago. Not because I was much of a Southern Baptist, but because, well, it was okay, and I wanted to make them kick me out so I'd get the headline in the newspaper. And I was always inquiring. I remember asking my Sunday school teacher when I was 12, how come all this stuff in the Bible that happens, we just talk about it, but it never happens? And I didn't know then I was talking about the mystical stuff. And he said, well, I don't know. Go ask the pastor. And the pastor said, well, we just study about it now. It doesn't happen anymore. That wasn't very satisfactory. So I went to seminary to find out more. Didn't find out more. But I was always inquiring. My verse for life was when Jesus said, I've got more to teach you, but you're not ready for it yet. And so I don't think that more stopped with the canonization of the New Testament. It's still going on. I think integral is some of the more that God has to teach us. And so I went along. I got my only church that called me after seminary was a Southern Baptist church, and I moved them along. For instance, it seemed to me that we kept calling God male names, and it made masculinity more divine than femininity. So I wrote my first book on is it okay to call God Mother? And the church voted to call God Mother. And we had a few men leave the church saying, nobody's going to tell my wife that I'm not in charge at home. And we started rewrote our hymns to have masculine and feminine names for God. And we moved along various ways. We called a woman pastor, started ordaining women, and those sorts of things. I became progressive to the extent I could. But it wasn't until I was 60, I came across Ken Wilber. And Ken, there was a kind of a transmission when I read all of Ken's books, actually. It was mostly a mental deal, but he gave me a framework for understanding Christianity. And he also inspired me by his own meditative practices to be serious about meditative prayer. And so I started then. And that was 23 years ago. And that jump-started my own spiritual life. I had wanted a more dynamic relationship with God and with Jesus. And that didn't start happening till then. The other factor that started happening, when I turned 60, the gays in our church started saying, Paul, you've changed your mind about everything else. How about changing your mind about us? We still had the benign policy of don't ask, don't tell. And why don't you read the Bible again and decide that God loves us like he loves you? So I did, and realized I'd been totally wrong. And so I changed my mind about that. And then doing that meant I changed my theological grid, and as a married man with 2 kids, realized that I was gay. that was a real awakening thing, and so I announced that to the church and my wife and kids, and they were mostly okay with that. But that sparked my own spiritual journey. What I found out is, as long as I kept my lid on my sexuality, I was keeping my lid on my spirituality. And so to take that lid off meant my spirituality really took a deep turn. And I guess that's when I became a mystic and started having all kinds of mystical experiences. So, and that's progressed since then. And the framework has been integral. And then more recently, I discovered Gebser. And reading Gebser, I had a transmission, but it was more of a whole body transmission and a more of a mystical transmission. So that sort of brings me up to date.
That's terrific. Thank you. You know, it's interesting because that's a story of a guy who changes his mind a lot, is willing to change his mind, and maybe even enjoys having his mind changed.
Yeah.
That's the opposite of what a lot of people think of when they think of religion and Christianity in particular. A lot of people have the sense that it's specifically about holding a fixed view no matter what. How do you, how much truth is in that? People who think that must exaggerate that to some degree, but there must be a lot of truth to it as well.
Well, yeah, sure. When religion is at the traditional mythic level, their job is to create stability, so we don't change, and that has its merits. There's some value in that, but they resist change. I know. I pastored my church for 49 years, and we slowly, very slowly, made these changes, and it was hard work. So I think Jesus came, and it was clear he included Judaism, but he transcended it, and he instituted change and said there's going to be more change. I've got more to teach you, but you're not ready. You're not at this current stage of mythical traditional stage. You're not ready for it, and I think we're ready for it now. We've got 25% of the culture is postmodern cultural creatives. And they're ready for the integral stage, even though they protest against it. And so I think we're moving along.
You think what's your take on the difference between like healthy and unhealthy traditionalism? Because I think that's a thing that's very difficult for people to tease apart. Like with the a lot of traditionalist groups seem to have an anti-gay position, right?
Yes.
And that just one of their local customary beliefs that helps stability, or is there very often something that we would now call psychologically unhealthy about that position, some kind of agitation in their own system?
Well, I think Ken Wilber puts it as transcend and include. I like Gebser better, who says the archaic, magic, mythic, and mental integral structures are all necessary, and they are all valid, and one of them is not more important than the other. Integral is not more important than mythical or traditional stage. And what's the difference between the mythical that's deficient or inadequate is that it's not very conscious, and it doesn't include the other stages. So when you take mythic or the traditional stage and enlighten it with a modernism or the mental stage and integral, it becomes transparent, and you see the values in it. You see there needs to be stability, and at the same time you see that there's much more, and we need to have all these structures and stages, encompass them all to make a fully integrated person. So that means some traditional people are going to stay there forever and die there and get to heaven and be surprised, and others are more early adopters and are moving and changing. And what's neat is that churches are losing members like crazy. So that affects the institution and helps the institution come to grips with needing to change.
Okay, well said. I'm interested in two different ways of thinking about the three faces of God, because you can have, you know, a self or a relational or a thing-like experience. But when some people talk about that, they sort of mean the totality of everything, reality or emptiness, right? As if you're having a personal relationship, a second person relationship with everything, almost like a Buddhist emptiness experience. But there's another version where God is something specific rather than something very general, where God has a will and a purpose and a flavor, and you're having a second person relationship with something that has specific purposes for you and for the beings of the universe. How do you negotiate between the three faces of God, as if we're talking about the cosmos in its three faces, and the three faces of God when we're talking about something specific that maybe wants the cosmos to go in a particular direction?
Yeah, I think that your first view is more of a Eastern view and a postmodern view. Actually, I see it as the first third person face of God is the cosmic impersonal God. It's not deism. It's God is not a deity. God is the ground of being. God, you don't have a relationship with the ground of being. You are the ground of being, and in the ground of being, and that's the cosmic face of God. The second person is relational, and we need. It's very hard to have a relationship with the ground of being or an idea or the cosmos, and we're relational beings. So we need our relationship, second person relationship, is second person, not second idea or second thought, but a second person. And so in Christianity, that's God, as we see it in a breakthrough way, that Jesus came to show us that God was love in a caring, personal way. And that we are all examples of that too. We are all incarnations of God. And in Buddhism and other places, it takes the form of bhakti yogi, a devotion to a personal God. The guy Ganesh you have right behind you is a wonderful Hindu personification of God. And I have a friend in Pune, India, who I'm teaching to meditate, and he meditates on Ganesh and goes to the temple, and I encourage that because that's his personal relationship, and it's very meaningful. And it would not be meaningful if I was going to expound on the ground of being. In third person, God is being itself. In second person, God is a being, a deity. And then in first person, we are also God. God lives within us as us. It's God being us. And what's so beautiful about that is it puts together East and West. It puts together the cosmic God with the personal God, with the New Age God, the Eastern God. It blends them all and integrates them. And I think personally, it's the most astounding thing when Ken came up with the three faces of spirit. It's so astounding. I wrote my last 2 books on it. That's what it's about. And what I found is people gravitate toward it. I have an amazing group of Unity pastors, and Unity is more postmodern. It likes that God is beyond us, and that sort of thing, or we're God. And second person, no, that's that Jesus stuff. We don't want to bother with that. And when I present the three faces of God, and I've taught at Unity Ministerial School, it suddenly breaks through, and they say, I've really missed God personally. I missed Jesus, and now I can have that too. And so I have a number of unity ministers who preach sermons on the three faces of God, because it seems balanced. And because we have, I mean, you and I are having a personal relationship now, and that's different than a theological discussion about being. And it's very, I mean, I love seeing you. I love relating to you because you're a very interesting person. And that's the way I feel about God now. I experience that personal thing that I'm with you, with God's presence, motherly, fatherly presence, that Jesus called Abba. Jesus had a very personal relationship with God. Called him the same name he called his dad, Joseph, called him Abba. And I sense God's fatherly, motherly presence like that. I also experienced Jesus's presence. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Jesus started touching me on my right arm. I feel him touching me right now. That's pretty personal. And also that's kind of woo-woo mystical, but that's why I'm a mystic. That's a very meaningful experience for me. And then it's very meaningful to me when I move into myself, particularly my gut, my spiritual womb. I think we all have a spiritual womb, whether we have a physical one or not, and that's our gut. I experience my own self-identity more and more as divine. When Jesus said he was the light of the world, okay, we all know that. But the striking thing he said, one of the most striking things, he said to the crowd that was gathered, full of agnostics, atheists, some Jews, but for people from all over, he said to them, looked at him and said, "You're the light of the world." What in the world did he mean by that? Well, I think he was saying you really are the light of the world, like I'm the light of the world. You're divine, and that divine light shines in you and every human being. And that's very exciting to me. So that puts them all together. That's my 5-minute lecture on it.
That's great. One of the things, I grew up in a kind of post-Christian household, but I now think of post-Christian as being a kind of Christian in a way. Like you still inherit these implicit patterns that are baked into the culture. So we had this Bible, and my mother would like to say sometimes that when Jesus said, "I am the light of the world," I think he meant that literally, she would say. I think he maybe was talking about photons, or she would do this sort of routine. And when I was a kid, what it meant to me was there were interesting things to decode in the Bible that might be more than what people think is in there.
Yes, that's right. Enlightening things. Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. You're a heretic before your time.
Is that a Dali print on the wall behind you?
Let's see.
That's that guy coming out of the egg there.
That's let's see, we'll get it over here. That's a print by a guy who had it's called Light and Day. My Dali print is over here. Let's see, there it is. St. John of the Cross. That was my first I bought my first artist image of Jesus when I was in my 20s, and I collected them for 60 years, and I now have a few left here in the room, but I collected eventually 240 of them from around the world, and they were hanging in the hallways of my church. And when I retired, I donated them to a college here in Missouri, and they put them in a gallery, insured them for $250,000. And I was never sure why I collected 240 images, artist images of Jesus. Some of them was theological, Jesus is a black guy, Jesus is a woman, Jesus is an Asian, and so on. But it wasn't until I came across let's see if you can see this guy here. There he is. That's by a Swedish artist,
Uh-huh.
and I gravitated toward that. I thought, Jesus is clearly not a blue-eyed blonde, and so I thought if Jesus had a passport photo, that would do. And I realized what I'd been doing. I'd been looking for an image of Jesus that I could relate to in second person.
Right.
I related to the 240 images I had in that more cosmic, theological, interesting, intellectual sense. But I was looking for one that I could relate to in a personal sense. And so the ones I have around me now cover all the bases. So anyway, that's a different stuff.
I was a devotee of surrealism in my
yeah.
So I got into Dali and some of his paintings, which are very good at being diaphanous in the Gebserian sense.
Yes.
Those were some of my first feeling experiences around Christ. But it's interesting what you're saying, because it wasn't personal. I wasn't necessarily relating to that cosmic Christ in that personal sense. It wasn't triggering that response pattern for me.
And yet it was a cosmic Christ.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
It was excited you and was awesome and mind blowing. Yes, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
lovely.
I didn't. Christianity wasn't an issue when I was a kid. We didn't do anything about it. Nobody preferenced it in any way. It wasn't that kind of cult. But aesthetically, were my major relationships, that I would see this figure in paintings and read about it in books, and once in a while have a very passionate emotional response. And then it moved into a kind of mystical thing, some visions and dreams.
Is that right?
Yeah. So I have a very peculiar history with it. It's never really been on the top, but it's been around the whole time. I don't think you can honestly get away from it if you are part of this culture.
You are a man of many facets.
I have a question about historicity. Like, most of the things you've said would still be a great integral Christianity, even if scholars tomorrow definitively said none of that stuff ever happened in the past.
Yeah.
So, like, what's the relevance? Is it significant? Is it important to believe in the historical events as historical events or not, in order to be part of a healthy, evolving future Christianity?
Well, what I think is the stuff in the Bible is true, and some of it happened. So it's at the mythic stage, traditional stage, which is where the Old Testament starts. Those myths, like the Genesis story and many of the other stories, contain a truth, and it's the truth of how they were viewing the world at the mythical or traditional stage. And that was a very important. Those stories gave them meaning to life and held life together, just like they do for us today, and just like Santa Claus does for a kid who's 3. And so there's truth in there. And I think you can trace the Bible is a story of the evolution of religion. It starts off with warring tribes fighting each other. And the Old Testament moves to the prophets, which is almost a postmodern position of crying for justice. And then along comes Jesus, who moves it into a more rational and mystical level. So I don't think it's dependent upon historicity, but neither do I think that for instance, scholars and historians, there's no historian now of any merit that thinks Jesus didn't exist. And there's some sort of basic deals that historians agree that about Jesus. And the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, including and the Gospel of Thomas, give you different pictures. And obviously they're not all literal or historic, because they tell different points of view of the story. So I think we have to sort of try to get out from that what the meanings are. The meanings are much more important than the history. Now, in terms of my experience of Jesus's presence and him touching my arm, well, Is that real or not? Well, it sure is real to me. And it fits with the reality experienced by mystics for hundreds and hundreds of years, including Buddhist mystics and Hindu mystics and Christian mystics and so on. So that's where it becomes very real for me. So I don't worry too much about historicity. And I think most of the things Jesus said, he probably did say, especially the ones in the Gospel of Thomas. I think he said the things in the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Thomas after he was crucified. He was communicating mystically in a channeling way to some of the disciples. So that accounts for their depth or their more elevated kind of sense. So it's not a big deal to me.
Yeah, I hold open a number of different options about what the history might have been, but it's pretty undeniable that whoever said the things in the Gospel of Thomas was a pretty amazing being.
Yes. Oh, yes. I love it. I had copies of the Gospel of Thomas printed up and told people to put it in their Bible right before Matthew, Mark, and Luke. My congregation, because it's wonderful.
Sometimes I think about basic modes of religion. There was always an interesting thing for me, like Meister Eckhart is almost a Zen monk.
Yeah.
In Christian terms. And on the other hand, there's a school of Buddhism where you worship a light compassion savior and call on him by name and have a relationship with him so that you are reborn into a more heavenly next world where your enlightenment can proceed. So, which one's the Buddhism and which one's the Christianity? They seem like they're very deep modes or alternative ways of doing human spirituality that are somewhat divorced from the particular cultural and historical baggage that gets associated with it.
Yes, a lot of truth in both of them. Yes. I stay a Christian because that's my story, but I believe we're supposed to honor all religious traditions and learn from them. And there's much to learn. My deal is Wilbur's deal about we don't need a new religion. We just need a new version of the old religions. And so that's what I move at. I desperately want Christianity to get updated.
What about people who are agnostic or atheistic or something like that? Do you think there's something they're missing by not being anchored to a tradition? Or do you think they're waiting for a new tradition? Or do you think they actually are, that is a tradition of its own, that's maybe always been with us and has its own depths and stages?
Well, yeah, people who are agnostic have their own strong points. Deconstruction is a necessary stage for all of us, and they may be in that, or that may be where they want to stay. That's okay. It's perfectly understandable. I think one reason I like Wilbur is he has a place for spirit. I like Jorge Ferrer at the California Institute of Integral Studies the same way. So I think it's hard to make a case for a world that has only material reality. But for those who want to stick with that, God bless them. They have a place to be in this world and something to teach us.
Yeah, I think there's depths and stages for those people as well, right? If you start to think about what is matter and where does it come from, you can end up in a materialism that's pretty spiritually dynamic.
Yes, you can. Yes, I think Ramon Panicar is one of my favorite theologians. He's a Spanish Jesuit theologian. Well, he died in 2010. He's famously said, "I left Europe as a Christian, became a Buddhist and a Hindu without ever ceasing to be a Christian." And he says that Christ is a Christian symbol for all of reality, divine reality, human reality, and material reality. So what that means for me is that material reality is also divine. It's also Christic, as well as human reality being Christic or divine. And it's hard to get away from that. Everything is ablaze with the glory of God.
Yeah, I think you see some of that in the Dali paintings, where
Yeah,
how he depicts Christ and how he depicts atomic reality are very similar and interblended.
I had a dozen Dali reproductions. I love him. Yes, and when he came into his, he had a conversion to Catholicism in the 1950s, and that's when he started doing the religious paintings. And I like him too.
I'm always intrigued by people who converted to Catholicism. Right? When
Yeah,
I was a kid, my image of Catholicism was this great engine, this cathedral of Western civilization. And when I'd meet people who were raised Catholic, very often they would tell me a different story. They were very unhappy with their Catholicism. But the people who converted, Marshall McLuhan, one of my favorite thinkers, became a
yeah,
Catholic late in life. Anne Rice, I don't know, the
yeah. I know,
vampire
Anne.
novelist. My mother read those vampire novels when I was a kid, and so I would read them. And there's one called Memnoch the Damned or Memnoch the Devil or something, where the lead vampire is taken into the past to witness the crucifixion. And I wept when I read this depiction, right? She's really good with the sensual details,
Yes,
but
she is.
converted, made me very, I'm like, oh, that's interesting.
She and I email. I think a lot of her. Yes, yes. She's wonderful. And then she became a Christian, for a while. I don't
Yeah,
think that stuck, but yeah. Yeah.
it's
She's
such an
wonderful.
interesting institution, Catholicism, and it's been through so many phases, right? The idea in general, it doesn't always live up to its idea, but the idea of a universal, higher cultural machinery is a beautiful idea.
It is. It is. It's too bad it's stuck in patriarchy,
Yeah.
which it severely limits its impact. Yeah.
I have some questions around the universal and the particular. I mean, it's similar to the third and second person in a way, but it has some shadings of its own. Like, I guess one of my favorite theologians is Kierkegaard.
Yes.
One of my favorite things that he ever talked about was if faith is the opposite of what's reasonable, then that he's a Christian because it's the least reasonable possible thing to think that the infinite was a finite thing and the transhistorical was a particular historical event. And he's like, this is so paradoxical and impossible. It makes zero sense, which is why you could have the most faith in it. And when I read that, I thought that's an amazing take. That's a really beautiful and non-dual take because you're not sure what's particular and what's universal. And then there's a question here for integral thinking, which is how important is it to focus on the universal and how important is it to focus on the particular? Are there things you can only do if you think of God as a particular thing? Sometimes I'm having this experience of God, and are there things that you can only get to by unpacking that and not being so locked into a particular version of it?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's the difference between thinking about love in general and having sex with your partner. One doesn't replace the other. Yeah. Yeah.
I just thought of another little story, which is I was at a party at my aunt's house years ago, and my cousin's midwife was there, an older woman who'd been their midwife when they were born. And my cousin came up to me and said, can you talk to her? She wants to talk about religion and nobody else wants to talk to her. So I went over to this sweet old lady and I would talk to her about the Lord. And I meant that in a very general, very archetypal sense. I could easily have been talking about Shiva and she would never have known. But she understood that word. And so she could tell me some of her insights, which she wanted to phrase that way. And I could see the structure of her insight because I was mediating it through this more abstract lens. And I ended up having a very beautiful conversation with her where she taught me some things that she could see that I hadn't seen, but I would never have heard those unless I was making it a little more general than the specific way she wanted to talk about it.
Yeah, sure. You were not stuck with the form that she was advocating. You were able to put it in a larger context. That's wonderful.
So that's, part of me thinks, great, that's evolution. That's the future. We universalize, we generalize. But another part of me loves a passage in Nietzsche where he praises the Jews over the Christians for having a version of God that reflects their form back to them. That contemporary people, so like you have a picture of what might be a more historical looking Jesus, which is one way to go at it. But another way is to say, our figure of the human embodied divinity should look like us, should have our attributes so that we see that brought back to us through our own type.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. And Gebser helps me with that when he talks about the magical dimension, which is what we're talking about some. He says the mental structure doesn't like the magical structure, and makes the magical structure makes the mental structure uncomfortable because it's hard to hold those two together. But the magical or mystical is what I translate that as, is not irrational. It's just another dimension of life, and I think it's a crucial dimension. The new organization that my ministry partner and I are starting is called the Integral Christian Network, and we are fostering a way of meditation, a meditative prayer that we've evolved, and it's called Whole Body Mystical Awakening. And it differs from a lot of meditation and even Christian meditation. Most meditation came from patriarchal societies, monks in the desert, or monks in a monastery, all men who like to stay in their heads and deny that they were sexual beings and didn't have bodies, and didn't admit they were connected with anybody else. They like to get off by themselves and meditate. So our deal is to know we're embodied creatures, and to be able to meditate and pray from our heads, our hearts, our guts, and our feet, anchoring and grounding us and our bodies in the earth, and to have mystical experiences in all of those. And I'm finding that this is the most exciting time of my life, coming into that practice. The practice I developed when I was listening to Ken, who is still one of my heroes, along with Gebser now. It was more of a mental practice, and opening up to get out of my head, and move into my heart space, move into my gut space, and move into my embodiment or my feet space has been really incredible. And to do that with others. So we start groups all over the world. We have people from every English speaking country in the world in our WeSpace groups that meet on Zoom, groups of about 7 or 8. And they meet every other week, and they share their lives. And then they do this whole body mystical awakening practice for 20 minutes. And it's just been amazing to see people come alive in what Jorge Ferrer calls spiritual knowing. At the California Institute of Integral Studies, they practice what's called the 4 Center of Spiritual Knowing. That is, they have their students in graduate school lay down, and an instructor touches them on their head, their heart, their gut, or their feet. And then they see what they experience in terms of inner knowing and spiritual knowing. And we've adopted that. That's the practice we have, and it's just been very exciting. It's helped put some of these things together for me. I wanted to get that in.
Terrific. The I guess we might say the early phase of integral Christianity was trying to stand for things like contemplative prayer and multiple lenses on the nature of God and the appreciation of different perspectives and developmental stages. But would you say like the leading edge of integral Christianity now is this full spectrum embodied kind of thing that you're discussing?
It absolutely is. More and more people are recognizing that staying with a cognizant head mentality is very limited. It's a very patriarchal way of thinking. You know, men like to think, they don't like to feel. And then at the point we can let our heart, and Buddhism, some aspects of Buddhism gets into the heart space. And the more we can let our gut move into that, that means that allows Eros to be a part of our spirituality. It's a spiritual resource. And then our whole body become a spiritual resource. I think that is integral practice has some aspects of that, but they reserve the internal part of meditation pretty much at a mental place. And so we're trying to counter that by saying it needs to be embodied. And when it gets embodied, it is much richer and multidimensional and more integrated. I mean, we want to have our head, heart, gut, and body integrated. And that's a more integral practice. I find it very exciting.
It would be a beautiful and very culturally useful thing if that kind of Christianity could flow into and blend with the traditional Christianity more, I think. Right? We see there's some wonderful things and some problematic things about traditional Christianity. But
absolutely.
if you have a healthier, more evolutionary orientation, that would be terrific for everybody.
Absolutely. Yes. That's what I've lived my life trying to promote. Yeah.
What's your take on people who grew up Christian and at some point in their childhood or adolescence broke away from it, had a very strong negative reaction somehow, and then maybe even became not just reasonable materialists, but kind of sort of anti-religious activists? What was it that happened to them that made that transition so hard and polarizing?
Oh, first of all, good for them, because they did what they had to do to get out of that jail or that oppression. And so it was a very important stage of spiritual growth to be in extreme deconstruction for some. And that's absolutely necessary. We don't move to another stage until we begin deconstructing the previous stage. So I have nothing but I'm a cheerleader for what they're doing, and they have to be in that stage for as long as they need to be. And what my job is to hold out alternatives that are possible when they're ready, when they're through with that, and want to start reconstructing, and this time with the more integral position. But I can sure understand why they're there, and I support them fully.
So integral has these sort of main facets. One facet is growth and development, becoming a deeper, more complex person. Another one is understanding that you can have different kinds of state experiences. Another one is, trying to show up in the world with more parts of yourself. But there's also the psychodynamics of cleaning up and dealing with ourselves. And I'm curious what your take on, how Christianity deals with its own shadow material. Because I remember when I was a kid, there was a big scare in the news about Dungeons and Dragons. Kids were playing board games and they were getting into satanic cults and molesting kids and all this stuff. Now, it turned out there was unorganized, very upsetting molestation of kids that was happening in the churches. Some of the, right, that weren't really Satanists and kids going into these things.
Right.
So they were aware that something like that was happening, but they were looking in the wrong place, a bit like
Absolutely.
the projection. So how do we clean that up?
That's right. That's what we do with our shadow. We put it out there so we don't have to deal with it. We can just attack it in other people. Yeah. Well, that happens anytime, Christianity in general is anti-eros and anti-sexual, and especially the Catholic Church, led by a bunch of people who don't have sex, quote. And so that's going to mess things up. So, and of course, that's where I spent 20 years in therapy to try dealing with my shadow, and did a lot of Gestalt work, what Ken would call 3-2-1 work, and that was very helpful. And to the extent that we don't integrate all parts of ourselves, we do project that out, and the shadow of the church is looming very large, especially around the sexuality. And well, that's what happens when we are partially Christianized, and the rest of it doesn't get into the light. So maybe some of these hard-boiled deconstructionists will help us see the light as they punch holes in our structures.
I guess I'm curious about your feeling about the role of myth and legend in education, right? In the United States, around Christianity, there's this big discussion. It's always been there about creationism in the schools or not. And I was involved in a group analysis of creationism in the classroom in the United States years ago, and I went into it assuming it was a bad thing. But at the end, I wasn't sure, because I thought we focus too much on the content of what we're telling kids about the world. And really, we should be, if you're training them in practices of reasoning and changing their mind and investigating, that's much more important than the story you're telling them about the world. And if people want to tell a different story, that's fine, as long as they're really learning how to do the procedures in an embodied way that lead you to deeper understanding. And it occurred to me that everybody who founded modernity had grown up, with a mythic education, and it didn't hold them back from becoming modern at all. So I'm curious, like, what's your take on mythicism in the schools?
Well, we all need stories to help life make sense. And as we move out of the mythic stage, our stories do change, and they have to change. So, of course, creationism just simply falls apart if you're going to live in the modern world. So I think that's an injustice to kids, and especially to put such a tenuous presupposition into their heads and relate it to their religion, because then it's going to be easy to say, oh, well, the whole thing is fallacious.
Right.
So, but the mythic structures are important, and they tell stories that are meaningful, and we need to replace them with more stories that are meaningful, that are more conscious and more truthful. So that's interesting that you were in that study. That's great.
Okay, here's a kind of mystic question, I guess. How do you understand the nails in the body in the crucifixion? What are the nails, and are we supposed to remove them or incorporate them?
Well, I think we're supposed to not be surprised when we get nailed. That's good. Yeah, and the cross itself, of course, is a powerful and deep story of suffering and because we all suffer. There's no way to get out of life without suffering. And just letting go of our ego is a great suffering, dying to our false self, our constructed self, so that our true divine self, in my words, can emerge. So I think the cross is very powerful. I in a Baptist church, you don't want to talk about the cross too much because people are so embedded in atonement theology. Jesus died for our sins. And I had, at least once a month, I had to talk about Jesus did not die for our sins. Our sins don't need dying for because God's not mad at us. And God is love and not hate. Jesus deconstructed the Old Testament by denying all the parts about God being angry and disagreeing with those and never quoting those. But the cross is very important. But we have mangled it up. Jesus did not appear on the cross until 9 centuries after the crucifixion, because that was the cross itself was the central emblem or symbol. But we've Augustine and other theologians, Anselm, moved into Jesus died for our sins, and then they built this whole edifice, basically the Catholic Church, around somebody needs to pay for your sins, and you're going to pay for them unless you believe in Jesus. And that's just a terrible untruth. And but deeper than that, if we could talk about the cross without getting into that, what a powerful symbol. And I think Jesus really did. He decided, for the sake of the message of love and upsetting the political and religious leaders, to speak up enough that it got him killed. And that's, he and Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all the others who've done that, following that incredible line of prophets that have paid that sacrifice. And I tell him that, when I connect with him every day, I tell him how grateful I am that he was so courageous. And I'm not that courageous. I don't like being crucified. So, but that's very meaningful to me.
That's lovely. The relationship of Christianity to books and language is very interesting. On the one hand, it seems totally obsessed with the written word, right? It's got the logos. You've got this book. There are these early, the people of the book went around attacking people who use statues and pictures for their religion, right?
Yeah.
You drive by a church and they put their favorite sentence on a huge billboard on the side of the road. They love language.
Yeah.
They love the book. On the
It's
other
a
hand,
new idol.
for most of the history of Christianity, most of the Christians couldn't or didn't read the Bible.
Right.
It was a very oral tradition. So, and now
Right.
we're in a slightly post-literary age where it's digital. We still have books. It's also sort of oral and acoustic now. Obviously, you're a book guy. You received transmissions from Ken and Gebser. You got a bookshelf behind you. What's your take on the significance of the book? Are we moving beyond it? Do we still need it? Are we too obsessed with it?
Well, yes, I am a big book person. Books have meant a lot to me. I had a library of 40,000 books before I gave it away, and I still,
Why did you give it away? Why did you give those books away?
I didn't have any room for them.
Ah.
My partner and I live in this 3-room apartment now. And so I kept a couple thousand of the books, and that's all I got room for. But that's very meaningful to me. Of course, I was a head person then. Now I'm a little more balanced. So I now only read 2 or 3 books a week. And but I get a lot out of that. Of course, the form is changing. I read my books on Kindle because that is a way to access them in more forms. And then I bring the ideas into my meditative prayer times and check them out with the rest of my body and with my guides. And so I integrate them. So it's not purely a head trip. I really value books. Of course, I don't do with the Bible what evangelicals done with it. It's not the Word of God. So I think I have a more realistic view, and it makes the Bible more available to me to find the truth that's helpful for me in it, especially the words of Jesus, and the authentic letters of Paul. I think Paul only wrote 7 of the letters attributed to him, and they're quite different from the other letters. The letters where he talks about slaves obeying your masters and women obey your husbands, he didn't write those. He was a real libertarian. He is a very liberating person who his experience with Jesus, he talked with Jesus, so had lots of conversations with him. So he was either a very smart mystic or deluded, and so I think a lot of the Apostle Paul too, who was a book person.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I had this impression that Jesus was great, and maybe Paul had taken this thing off the rails and generated the problematic history of Christianity. But the more I looked into it, the more I started to appreciate the enormous cultural contribution this guy made in essentially setting up the communities for a whole new kind of culture of saying, hey, we're not going to be Greeks or Romans or Jews here. We're starting a new thing. Right. And he got that thing off the road. That thing that he started changed world history. That's an amazing thing that Paul did.
He did that. And he also evolved from Jesus. He evolved cosmic Christology. He evolved Jesus, who was called the Christ, meaning the Messiah. But Paul left that meaning of Messiah behind. And Messiah or Christ for Paul became the cosmic Christ, the Christ that was universal and was much expanded beyond anything that Jesus talked about. And without Paul, we wouldn't have that cosmic Christology and unbelievably expanded way of thinking, and Paul's view that we are all in Christ, and that he was a universalist, to the shame of traditional evangelicals. So Paul's vision is very exciting to me. His intellectual vision of the third person face of God is wonderful.
I saw a piece of writing the other day where you were talking about the relationship between integral consciousness and gamma waves. And this is interesting because there's a theory that, more advanced states of mind are associated with these more intense brain waves. And I've really only heard this theory from guys who are into Gebser.
Well, that's true. It has yet to be fully explicated, but it does seem. I mean, my experience in different states of consciousness follows that. I use binaural beats into both my ears that help me move into subtle states of consciousness. And it does seem like it is associated with certain brainwave patterns and it's just hard to get away from that. I use that as a way to point to there's some basis in science to point to mystical stages and states that we sure need to explore. I wouldn't stake anything important on it, but it does seem to be interesting.
The thing that interests me about it a lot is the idea that there's these two different ways to be outside of normal consciousness. One is slowing down and the other is speeding up. And there's a kind of implicit argument about that, I think, in some of the Eastern traditions. For example, when you do Zen koan practice, is the koan supposed to make you let go of rationality and kind of relax? Or is it supposed to put you into a high performance mode where you really work hard to solve that puzzle?
Yes. All of the above.
Yeah. Gamma waves are associated with really doing something. And then the alpha waves, I think a lot of people in the 20th century were very attracted to alpha waves because they just felt tense and wanted to relax.
Yes. Very true.
Well, actually, what have you read lately that was really good that you've enjoyed besides Gebser? What's the last book that you were like, oh, wow, this really changed my mind?
Now you're asking me to name. I'm 83 and I don't remember things very well. Okay, let's see. I read every night before I go to bed. Let's see. Last night I read some academic papers, and book-wise, I don't remember the authors. I'm not going to be much help to you there.
Okay. maybe it'll bubble up. How about is there music you like that relates to your mysticism or your relationship to Christianity?
Oh yes.
Because I know for myself, Christian rock was always kind of a lame joke when I was a kid. But at the same time, when I heard that black, blues, and gospel music, that's some of my most direct affirmation of the Christian spirit.
Yes. Well, when I was a kid in grade school, I would rush home to turn on the radio, which is all we had, to listen to the Lone Ranger. And the reason I listened to the Lone Ranger was not because I wanted to hear the story. It's because I wanted to hear Mendelssohn's overture to Fingal's Cave and the William Tell overture. It was just blew my mind. I didn't know the names of them, but I knew that was the most exciting music I had ever heard. And so I grew up loving classical music, and that's the music that most inspires me now. Mozart it's heavenly. Beethoven. So I pretty much exclusively listen to classical music. My partner who is that's my partner who is I decided to break the racial barrier, the age barrier, and the gender barrier.
What's his name?
Ivan.
And
Ivan, as an African American, he likes a different kind of music than I like. So we alternate in the car, listening to his kind of music and listening to mine. And but I find that the classical music, but people find country music as very enlightening and lift their spirits, what's your favorite kind now, music?
I don't know. I've always been a soundtrack guy. Even when I was a little kid, the songs I liked most were from the movies I liked most. And I could never tell if that was a coincidence or whether one of them caused
Yeah,
the other.
yeah.
But even today, if I watch a really interesting new TV show, I'll probably listen to the soundtrack from that show for the next 6 months.
Ivan does the same thing. I don't even pay attention to the music in a TV show or a movie, but he remembers it and gets the tracks. So yes, I can understand that. That's yeah, that's wonderful.
That actually makes me think of one of my favorite movies as a kid, which was The Blues Brothers. It sort of brought all that black music to the white audience, but it had this beautiful scene where they go to the church and James Brown is the pastor. And then the light comes through the window and illuminates Jim Belushi, and he now feels like he's got a mission from God.
Yep. Yeah. That was great.
Yeah, so when I was a kid, that was my mental image of a Christian mystical experience.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. You youngster, you.
I'm intrigued by your life of faith sort of opening up to mystical experiences later on, versus my own. Like, I was more of a Gnostic and ended up as more of a Pistic, which is to say, in my 20s, I was obsessed with having spiritual and mystical experiences and was often very successful. But where I am now, the general residue of that seems much more important. Trusting that thing feels more profound to me than the state experiences. I feel like I've moved from mysticism to faith. You started with a lot of faith and have incorporated a bunch of mysticism now.
Interesting. Very interesting. So what do you think accounts for that for you?
I think part of it is having succeeded at something. Like, if you travel, then you never have to worry that maybe you should travel. So, if you've seen the face of God and if you've felt yourself in eternity, you can relax about that a little. Like, you confirmed that. So now you can relax. But I think there's a lot of my own practices involve attempting to blend and harmonize different aspects of myself. And when that's successful, it creates something like an overtone, which exceeds me. And it's happened often enough that I can sort of hear that overtone all the time. So I can kind of rest with it to a large degree.
That's so interesting.
I haven't stopped doing any practices. I do practices all the time, but there's a confidence that perhaps comes from their success that I now have.
It's really interesting. So how do you view the actual mystical experiences you used to have?
I mean, I would recommend them. They don't feel as emotionally important to me as they did at the time. I view them as material that I need to separate my interpretations out of now, because I'm very curious. There's an immediate way that you say it to yourself, right? You go, "Oh, I'm beholding the face of God. That's what this is. And it's super important that this is happening to me right now." But then later you think there could be other explanations, and I'm a tree, right, that would account for the same experience and the same importance of that experience, but I could say it a different way. So that's very interesting to me.
What was the context you had the mystical experiences in?
It was the context was simply my life. I was a lot of it in nature, but a lot of it in meditation. Sometimes unexpected relationship situations would trigger these things.
Huh. So it was not in a religious setting?
No, I mean, depending on the meaning of the term. I was seldom in a building that was devoted to religion. Even though I went to those a lot, I didn't often have mystic experiences around them.
Yeah.
Often it was just embedded in my life. Though I was in a Buddhist Sangha for a while, and we had a service together every Sunday. So I would always go to a different temple before that. So I'd gone to all the churches in my city because I went to a different one each time to try to balance out the Buddhism that I was working on. And they were neat, but it was seldom really mystically transformative.
You're a very hungry person, aren't you? You're an adventurer. I love it. I love that. That's quite remarkable, Layman. That's quite remarkable. Wow.
Wow. That's interesting to hear. That's neat feedback.
Yeah.
Certainly relate to it.
It is wonderful. And you're pursuing your hunger in many areas. And I think that's marvelous. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing, which lets that what you've learned and gained in connecting with other people lets that emerge. And it occurs to me that's what's prepared you for doing what you're doing, and that's why you're so good at it. So that's just wonderful. I love it. You're very inspiring.
Thank you, Paul. That was a great end speech, but I don't necessarily want to end yet.
I'm not ready to end either, but I am inspired. So I wanted to put that in.
What else strikes you about the spirit, the ethos, the milieu of integral Christianity? If you just sort of resonate with it for a moment, what comes up for you? What's going on there that's interesting? We talked about the embodiment, but is there anything else lurking in it that we should know about?
Well, it's very satisfying intellectually. It's satisfying. My life is filled with bliss. Every time I move into my heart space, I'm flooded with bliss. Can't beat that. I feel like beginning with Ken, I was able to get my intellectual approach together, and then Gebser's helped me. The transmission there helped me move it into the rest of my body, and it's very, very satisfying. And then I've always been a kind of a leader type, I that's wherever I would be, I would end up saying, let's go this way and do this. And so I've traded my Southern Baptist congregation, which ended up pretty integral, and I've traded that for a international congregation. It is very exciting. Luke Keeley, who co-founded Integral Christian Network with me, we start new groups, and we start new groups, 2 or 3 or 4 every week around the world. And that means we meet with them for 3 times and turn them loose on their own. And we meet the most fascinating people just from all around the world. And these are not people who are Southern Baptists. They are people who meditated for years, who've been to everybody's course. They come from all paths, and it is just incredible, and to be like we are right now on Zoom, and to feel their presence in the terms of the energy field that it's created by when people who are open to those things, like you are and I am, that's created, and to enter that with these amazing people, and to talk about the things I love to talk about, since they read the things I write and like my books, and so they're, and it's so very exciting, and to see them engage in the practices that Luke and I have come up with, and that they're creating too, as we evolve. It's a different form of church, and it's a Christian network, but it's that progressive Christianity I've been after all my life, and it's happening, and it's it's evolving around the world, and it's incredibly satisfying. And I'm 83 now. I keep hearing I'm going to live to be 92. I hope so, because it's just so fascinating to be with people from all walks of life, people who are spiritual directors and counselors and PhDs and ordinary other people, but all interested in this kind of spiritual Christian path. And I can't tell you how this is the most exciting time of my life, the last 3 or 4 years. When I retired 8 years ago, I thought, well, what am I going to do now? You know, so now I know what I'm going to do, and I'm doing it. And to meet people like you, I mean, this is really exciting. The privilege of actually sitting down and talking for an hour and a half with somebody like you. Wow, what a privilege! So this is a very exciting time of life.
This experience is a bit like religion for me. The resonance and the exchange and the blending, and it's a bit like non-dual personal mystical experience. Something is shared.
Community.
Very much that's like I was saying, for me, spirituality has a lot to do with integrating my parts and creating an overtone. And I think that happens between people as well. And so sometimes that happens in a way that's based on an individual messiah or teacher, but other times it can just start happening in a culture and they start to become as if religious.
Yeah. I like Jorge Ferrer. I don't know how acquainted you are with him. He's a brilliant integralist and corrective to Ken, but he postulates that there's not one single spiritual ultimate, but there's an ocean of liberation, and there are many shores on that. And so it's not, we're not all headed towards one God, one spirit, but each shore has its own validity. So I don't pretend that Ganesh is the same God as Jesus, but it has great validity. And it's true. So I don't know why I brought that up. Let's see. What was my train of thought? It's like going into the room and why am I here? But anyway. Oh well. So this I'm amazed. I mean, you're another shore. So the shore you represent is very exciting to rub shoulders with and hearts with. That's lovely.
Yeah, I like Jorge a lot. Bruce and I had a very nice discussion with him about
Oh, did you?
And hopefully we'll have another one. And there's a sophistication of thinking there that a number of us have been working on, where same and difference and one and many are sort of blurry concepts. And you go, well, is divinity a singular or plural phenomenon? Well, yes, it is. Is Ganesh the same as Jesus or different? Yes.
Yeah, it's great. And I love it that every year the word is fuck. It's amazing. Shoot. Yeah.
Who do you, when you look back at the history of Christianity, who were the great saints for you? Who were the main guys who you felt really got it or moved the project forward a little?
Well, of course, Meister Eckhart is pretty high on the list there, and St. Francis. In terms of going back further, I've studied Augustine and all these other, but they were just such captives to another level of Christianity that I don't find them helpful. In terms of spiritual guides, one of my guides is John, the Beloved. So I hold him in high esteem, and Mary, Jesus's mom, and Mary Magdalene. They're very interesting and very different presences. That's I'm more like current theologians and saints. History between the New Testament and now, history doesn't interest me much, except to see how things have gone and how things have evolved. So that's kind of me.
Well, who are the contemporary theologians and mystics that you really resonate with or appreciate?
Well, I've named Ramon Panicar and Jorge Ferrer and Ken Wilber and Gebser. I consider them mystics and theologians. And there's a scattering from the books behind me of friends who've written books and others that I take a piece of what they're saying that contributes. So if I read a book and I can find one thing in it that enhances what I'm looking for, that's good, but they don't become my all-time favorite because of that. That's why I have to read so many books, because I just get a piece here and there, you know.
You're looking for the leading edge paragraph.
Yeah, that's right. and a lot of the books I read are murder mysteries and gay romance stories. So there you are.
Well, this has been absolutely a terrific conversation, Paul. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I don't get an opportunity to melt into my Christian mystical self very often. So I appreciate it.
I'm glad you felt at home to do that. That's wonderful. Yeah. You have a wonderful self.
Thank you.